Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. You'll also find our archives, where you can listen to every episode we've ever done going back to 2006. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is August 30th, 2013, and my guest is David Epstein, a writer at Sports Illustrated and author of The Sports Gene, Inside the Science of Extraordinary Athletic Performance. David, welcome to EconTalk.
Thanks for having me.
Our topic today is your book, The Sports Gene. It's a fabulous book. I learned many captivating and fascinating things about sports and lots of other topics. It is about sports, but it's really about a lot more than sports. It's about human achievement generally and the age-old question of nature versus nurture. What role does genetics play? What role does environment play? And it's relevant for some of the educational issues we've been talking about, and I expect we'll get into all these over the next hour. I want to start with the role of training and the role of practice in creating greatness. Malcolm Gladwell, in his book Outliers, put forth an argument that there's something magical about 10,000 hours of practice for creating mastery in sports, music, and other areas. What's his claim? Where does it come from? And what's your take on it?
Well, so the 10,000-hour rule originates, although it's often called Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000-hour rule, it actually originates with the work of Anders Ericsson, a psychologist at Florida State, and it comes from one particular study that used 30 violinists who were already so highly pre-screened that they had gained admission to a world-famous music academy. So this is not a study that was set up in a way that can look for the existence of innate talent, because it was starting at the very, very highest level. It's like starting with NBA players and then ignoring that their average height is 6'7" and saying only practice got them to where they are. And the top 10 from that group averaged 10,000 hours, not at their peak, but by the age of 20. They actually went well beyond that at their peak. But there was quite a bit of individual variation between there. 10,000 was just an average. But some people made it to a certain level faster and others slower. And one of the things that I've pointed out is that it isn't, in fact, a magic number, as it's called in Outliers, because taking the average necessarily obscures all the individual variation that shows up in every single study of any type of skill development.
You give some counterexamples, dramatic counterexamples, and of course, anecdotal evidence can be informative. It could prove that it's not, at least a claim isn't always true. It can disprove a strong claim. But it is interesting, the variety of success that people achieve with and without training. Obviously, most great athletes, most great musicians train like crazy, but not all of them. So tell us about that high jumper.
Right. So in my second chapter, I sort of tell a story I call The Tale of Two High Jumpers, in which I sort of profile two high jumpers, one named Stephen Holm, who over the course of 20 years, and by his estimate, 20,000 hours, made incremental progress every year to the point where he became one of the best high jumpers in the world. And then in 2007, he travels to the World Championships and is met by a total unknown, a Bahamian jumper by the name of Donald Thomas, who just recently had started high jumping basically because he found out he was good at it on a lunchtime bet at his college. And so Donald Thomas is closer to 0 hours and Stephen Holm is closer to 20,000 hours. So they average 10,000 hours. But Donald Thomas actually wins that competition. And so I thought it was a good story to explain the fact that not only is there huge variation, but different athletes can get to the same place via both different biology and different training programs. So that nature or nurture question has sort of always been a fallacy.
Now, practice does make something. It may not make perfect. It may not get you an Olympic medal. Obviously, it can improve almost anything, any innate trait, whatever level you start with, right?
That's right. And so when you look at the study of chess, for example, which in many ways has similarities to the kind of perceptual mastery that a quarterback develops, it takes a long time for everyone to become a grandmaster, for example. And it takes thousands of hours. Nobody achieves it before that. That said, the range of variability, the range of time it takes people to get to that level, and many never get to that level, gets enormous from people who make it in a few thousand hours to people who are at 50,000 hours and haven't made it. So the complex tasks definitely require more practice to achieve mastery. At the same time, the individual variation becomes even larger.
And there's a guy right now who's testing, again, it's only one data point, but it sure is interesting, a guy who's testing the 10,000-hour thesis with golf.
Yeah, this is Dan McLaughlin. He was a commercial photographer, and his day job was sort of largely taking photographs of dental equipment, and he decided he wanted a life change, and so he dropped everything and he read a couple books that talk about the 10,000 hours, and he decided to put in his first hour of training to be a pro golfer. He got a PGA certified coach, and he's tracking every hour along the route to expertise. He should reach 10,000 hours in 2016. I think he's about a 6.5 handicap now. But he's making this big show of doing the 10,000 hours. But when I asked him, and what he told me in the book, he says, well, I think you could master a task in anywhere from 7,000 hours to 40,000 hours. But obviously the 7,000 to 40,000 hour rule doesn't have the same ring to it.
But the real question for me is I'm 5'6". Mm-hmm. My NBA career, if I said, I'm tired of being the host of EconTalk, I'm going to hire a trainer and become an NBA basketball player, 400,000 hours wouldn't do it. And we'll talk in a minute about NBA, the NBA, where you have a lot of interesting things to say specifically about the NBA. But my point is that obviously the 10,000 hour claim is silly. There's nothing magical about 10,000 hours. It's not like at 9,999 you're an awful golfer and then that last hour puts you over the top.
And it's way low for most skills too.
Well, that's the crucial question. So if I wanted to become, let's say I wanted to learn to play The Entertainer by Scott Joplin on the piano. I've never played the piano. I know what a chord is on the piano. Is it near certain, somewhat certain that there is some number of hours within a human lifetime that I could master that if I have, say, virtually no musical ability?
So, first of all, in music and other things like language, there are clear developmental windows that you don't want to miss. So in golf, there's less evidence of that kind of window where your genes and your environment need to coincide at a particular time in order to get the best output. But for music, like to have perfect pitch, for example, you basically have to have been exposed to music in some major way, probably studying it by the age of 6, or you're just not going to have perfect pitch unless you speak a language like Mandarin, which is a tonal language, which can make up for it. But so you would be facing the issue of a developmental window. Would you learn to play it eventually? I think you absolutely would learn to play it eventually, but I don't think you would ever. I think it would take you a lot more practice, than someone who started earlier and might be more disposed to that. And I don't think you would ever play it as well as them necessarily.
But, you talked about a developmental window. You also say in the book, no slow child became a fast adult. So if I'm not sufficiently genetically gifted in running, it doesn't matter how many hours I put in training and lifting weights and sprinting and doing the right nutritional things, I'm not going to get there.
Yeah, I mean, that's in running for sure. So to contrast that to piano, one of the things that we know is important in learning a motor skill like piano, which like piano is a perceptual motor skill, is building myelin, like the insulation for your neurons. It's sort of like insulation for a wire, making sure that the signal is being transmitted as fast as possible. And you can, throughout your life, continue to build that. It never stops. It starts to deteriorate and become more difficult when you're older, but you can improve throughout your life. In terms of running, I actually just saw a study. I didn't see this in time to include it in the book because it just came out, of Oklahoma State football players over 4 years of a strength training program, in a major Division I college program. And they found that lifting weights greatly increased their ability to lift weights in the gym and made no difference to their sprint speed. All indications from a huge body of work are that if you want fast adults, you have to start with fast kids.
Did it help with anything else, though? Could they lift their suitcases more easily?
I'm sure they could lift a lot more weights. It didn't improve their vertical jump either, which I was a little surprised at. And so I think this actually highlights the fact that, and I saw this when I was a national level track runner, is that a lot of these sort of hidebound traditions of strength coaches have athletes doing things that there's no proof that it's linked to their actual performance goals on the field.
Yeah, we'll come back to weightlifting maybe at the end because I'm interested in that. Talk about Jenny Finch. You wrote there's a great excerpt from your book online that we'll post. Jenny Finch is one of the greatest, if not the greatest, women's softball pitchers. And talk about what happened when she faced Major League Baseball players.
So this was in 2003. She was invited to participate in a charity softball game, and she was actually only invited as a ceremonial coach originally. She wasn't meant to pitch, but some of the guys wanted to crank a couple homers off of her. So in pregame practice, right, exactly.
Didn't quite work out that way.
Yeah, this shows how little athletes know about how they do what they do, I think, because they expected to hit home runs off of her. And because the ball's bigger, and the transit time of the softball pitch at the speed she throws it from a little closer distance is exactly the same as the pitches they face in baseball.
So it's the equivalent of about 95 miles an hour from a pitcher's rubber.
Yep, which is fast but pretty typical. Jenny throws in the mid-60s and from 43 feet. And they couldn't even hit foul balls off of her. And it turns out that reflex, I thought Major League Baseball players just have fast reflexes. But it turns out it's not the case. I actually scored faster on a visual reaction time test than Albert Pujols did.
Congratulations.
And the human biology is just not capable of tracking an object moving that fast. So
I have to interrupt, David.
Sure.
You're not exceptional on the reaction. It's that Albert Pujols is totally average.
Oh, right. He scored he scored 66th percentile compared to a random group of college students.
Yeah.
So a little better than a random group of college students. But so the advice to keep your eye on the ball, for example, is nonsense. You can't do it. The angular position is changing too quickly as it gets close to you. And the minimum amount of time it takes to initiate muscular motion, in response to something you see is 1/5 of a second. And that's half the flight time of the pitch just to initiate muscular action. So the way that hitters are actually able to accomplish this is they've learned perceptual cues, like the movement of a pitcher's shoulder before the release, the flicker of the ball, which is the flashing patterns the seams make right when it's released that allow them to basically predict the future so that they can really decide where to swing long before they have to do it. So it's very much a learned skill.
Well, the other extraordinary thing that you chronicle in there is the eyesight difference between it's not so much reaction time, but eyesight. Right. Talk about some of those differences between pro baseball players and me.
Right. So this is why I use the hardware-software analogy in that section of the book, where I talk about it's software. These perceptual cues that players have learned are software. It's like something that you download, something that you learn, which is why they can't hit when they have to face someone with an unfamiliar shoulder motion, unfamiliar ball rotation. That said, once you learn those perceptual cues, it is of the utmost importance that you are able to pick them up as early as possible in the pitch so that you're not left relying on reaction speed. And it turns out that major league hitters have average visual acuity of about 20/12, which means that they can see from 20 feet away what I have to move to 12 feet away to see. So they are useless without their learned skills. But once you have those learned skills, you have a better full machine if you also have the hardware that allows you to pick up those cues much earlier. And
that's a common theme of the book, right? What you call the intertwining of acquired skills and genetic or natural ability.
Absolutely. I mean, there are no outcomes without both genes and environments. And as much as sort of people want a blanket conclusion about how much of sports expertise is nature and nurture, it very much depends on this, not only specific athlete, but the specific sport task. And I try to bring that out throughout the book.
So before we leave the 10,000 hour story, I know that Malcolm Gladwell's responded publicly to your book in a recent article, and I know you've appeared with him. What's his response?
Well, I think it's sort of been twofold. So he said he enjoyed the book, and he feels like I made a bit of a straw man argument with the 10,000 hours. I should say, beyond Gladwell, others have taken a much more strict stance than him. He sort of says in Outliers, 10,000 hours is a magic number, but yeah, people are talented too. Whereas some of the other books and talks and things like that, people have said, well, it's 10,000 hours, there's no room for genes. But Malcolm has said sort of that he said yesterday when I was on radio with him that the 10,000 hours shouldn't be applied to sports, that it should only be applied to more cognitively complex tasks. That said, sports scientists who study sports expertise think of the sorts of responding and decision-making that athletes have to do as extremely cognitively complex tasks, as complex as anything that we do. So I think sports scientists would argue with him. And his other point was that there are no naturals, right? Like nobody learns to be a grandmaster in chess without thousands of hours of practice. And I don't disagree with that at all. Just like no one learns human language without many, many hours of practice. That doesn't mean that there aren't different abilities to pick it up that show up in the individual variability.
Some exceptionally gifted people get a head start. And as you point out, they also have a head start in their willingness to train, their taste for training, their passion, their will, stamina. There's a thousand things that are mixed in with this, some of which are genetic, some are not.
Right, exactly. And actually one of the biggest surprises in the reporting of the book for me was I sort of knew that there was plenty of literature showing that physical training influences your dopamine system, the chemical environment that is involved in pleasure and reward in your brain.
Right.
I didn't know that there was such voluminous literature showing that how your dopamine system is in the first place influences your drive to be physically active. That was a really interesting finding to me, an interesting chapter for me to write.
Yeah, you point out there's huge differences in people's disposition to be active, to move around versus to be on the couch.
And of course I picked, and I guess intuitively, when I was training, I sort of knew that I had teammates who needed to be managed to train as much as they should and others who need to be managed to train less. But that line of reporting led to one of my favorite interviews in the book, which was with Pam Reed, one of the greatest ultramarathon runners of all time. When I interviewed her, it was the day after she had just finished U.S. Nationals in the Ironman triathlon, having qualified for World Championships. And she's an extreme. She feels uncomfortable when she has to sit still. So she's at LaGuardia Airport while I'm interviewing her and her flight's delayed and she's running. So she stashed her bags and she's running laps around the parking structure while I'm talking to her.
The day after an ultramarathon.
Yeah, the day after.
Right. It's extraordinary.
Yeah. So that's extreme, but I just thought it was really interesting. And so she herself is always reading studies of how scientists breed mice for their motivation to run because she's really interested in how she got that way.
Yeah, that's incredible. One last thing, I just want to stick with the 10,000 thing for one more thing. That golfer, you just sort of mentioned in passing, and I almost forgot when you said it to ask you. You said he's down to a six handicap?
I think he's a 6.5 handicap.
What did he start at?
I don't know what he had no experience. He'd only gone to driving ranges before. He had no experience. So he's
impressed.
Quite a long way.
I'm impressed.
I'm very impressed. And I think it was astute of him to say, well, I think you could master the skill anywhere from 7,000 to 40,000 hours. Maybe he'll be a 7,000 hour guy. Who knows? That said, there's some evidence that he's facing some diminishing returns in terms of his rate of progress right now.
Yeah. Speaking of diminishing returns, you make a fantastic mix of economics and medicine and statistics observation when you refer to an article, you'll tell me when it was written, that predicted that it was only a matter of time before women world records surpassed those of men in many areas. People were looking at the trend and how the record-setting times, and I forget which sports they were, but some track and field and swimming for women were improving so rapidly now that women were becoming more athletic, and it was only a matter of time before they passed those of men. That didn't happen. Explain what the mistake was.
So, and those were actually scientific journal articles from scientists both in the late 90s and early 2000s where they basically looked at the trajectory of women's world record progression. So seeing that women, who had previously basically been barred from having competitive opportunities in large part, once they were allowed to compete, their records were coming down really fast. And if you graphed those and extrapolated where they were going, you would see them passing men in every running distance, basically. The problem, I think, was twofold. One is that women they were first in the early part of the learning curve because they had been blocked from participation. So, and that's the same thing you see whenever a sport opens up, is you see a quick progression of records that then has diminishing returns. But also, a lot of that trajectory came from the 1980s, what's sort of known as the mega doping era for female athletes. So testosterone and its analogs, which are steroids, have a huge impact on female athleticism. And that basically all the track and field records now date back to the 80s, when we now know, because of released records, there was huge systematic doping in Eastern Bloc countries. And so since that has gone away, not that doping has gone away, but mega doping is much more difficult to do, women actually appear to be getting slower. And so the biological gap between men and women is now opening because women can no longer set records while men occasionally inch forward a little bit, and largely due to Usain Bolt only.
Right. He's kind of, he's an outlier.
Yeah, for sure, by any stretch.
You do make the observation, which I applaud for its intellectual honesty and its the power of the observation, that if genetics didn't matter, men and women should have the same outcomes. It's just women might have to practice a little longer, but in certain areas they simply cannot and will not due to muscle mass and other things. They're close in, I think it was swimming. is the closest. Is that right?
Long distance swimming, the performance difference is about 6% at the top end. Yeah.
Where is it larger?
In track and in running events from every distance from 100 meters to 10,000 meters, it's 11%. If you take the top 10 men, they're the average times versus the top 10 women. And so, at 10,000 meters, for example, a man who made the bare minimum qualifying standard for the Olympics would lap the women's world record performance. But the biggest are in throwing events. So despite shot put, javelin, so like in the javelin, despite the women throw a lighter implement, and it's still about a 30% difference in performance, even with the lighter implement.
So let's talk about NBA and basketball. You have just an extraordinary array of interesting observations about basketball. There was the implication, I think it's in Gladwell, and then we'll leave him behind, but I think he talks about how or maybe you generalize that he says that after an IQ of 120, it doesn't help you that much, which I think is probably not true, but that's his claim. And there's a related claim, or did you make the analogy to height in basketball? After a certain height, it doesn't matter that much.
He made the analogy to basketball.
So what is it?
Evaluated it.
Yeah, go ahead.
That after a height of about, it's called the threshold hypothesis, that after a certain threshold, more doesn't really matter. You're already good enough. And he put that at about 6'2", for basketball, saying, it's better to be taller, but beyond 6'2", it doesn't make that much of a difference. And saying, hey, sort of look at Michael Jordan. He's not nearly the tallest guy who's ever played in the NBA. So I just kind of set out to evaluate that threshold hypothesis for the NBA.
And you found?
And I found that that's not quite true. So I found, first of all, to my amazement, that height is a much more narrowly constrained trait than I would have guessed.
What does that mean?
It's so what statisticians would call a leptokurtic curve. So it's an inverted U curve, but very narrow, like really, really looks like a mountain. It falls off quickly. So 68% of American men are just in the 6-inch range from 5'7" to 6'1". And so beyond that, it starts falling really, really quickly. So at 6'2", actually, with about every 2-inch increase in height, the chances of being in the NBA go up about an order of magnitude until it starts to just get silly, where at like 6'10", you have a 3.2% chance of being a current NBA player if you're an American man between ages 20 and 40. And at 7 feet, there actually is no percentile from the CDC data that I was using at 7 feet, because no 7-footer has shown up in any of their surveys in the thousands and thousands of people.
Because there aren't enough of them.
Right, but if you follow the curve, and I make it clear that it's an estimate, it suggests that if a 7-foot man in America who's between ages 20 and 40, he has a 17% chance he's in the NBA right now.
Yeah, I'm actually surprised it isn't higher. Because
I sort of am too, actually.
Because if you're 7 feet, this again comes back to the practice point. If you're 7 feet tall, you have such an advantage. If you could work hard enough, the financial returns are extraordinary. Yeah. And of course, 17% is a very big number. There probably isn't another profession where more than 17% of the 7-footers are doing it now. It's basketball centric. There's no doubt about it. But it is interesting given how lucrative it is that there aren't more.
Yeah, no, for sure. And again, that at 7 feet, since there was no percentile, that's very much an estimate. But I agree with you. And some people, I've gotten input from people both saying, "Oh, that's got to be too high," and others saying, "Oh, that's got to be too low." So, but that's interesting. Let me ask you a question. So you mentioned that you're 5'6", and you talked about the NBA. So can you touch the basketball rim, or have you ever been able to?
Well, when I was younger, David, I could get my wrist. No, I cannot touch the rim.
Okay, so the grand total number of men who have been tested in NBA Combine who can't touch the rim and have made the NBA is 0. So
that's shocking.
Yeah, so there you go.
So I mean, well, there's always a first. I could be the white swan who drifts upward into the NBA despite not being able to touch the rim, but it hasn't happened yet, you're saying.
Right. So the short players, often they both have long arms, and so far every one of them has been at least able to grab the rim, usually much higher than that. But the very shortest guys in the NBA tend to have unbelievable jumping ability. I mean, 2 of the shortest players in NBA history both won the dunk contest. So I think they had other compensatory mechanisms for their height.
Yeah, so that's Spud Webb.
Webb and Nate Robinson, yeah. And then Muggsy Bogues, who was 5'3", was actually an amazing jumper. He just couldn't palm the ball.
But he could touch the rim.
He could dunk a volleyball. Yeah, he just couldn't palm the basketball.
So let's talk about wingspan. That was one of the most extraordinary things I didn't realize that I learned in your book. Many people have seen the famous drawing, it's Da Vinci, right, of a man circumscribed in a circle with his his arms reaching wide and the circle going above his head. So for the average person, wingspan, tip to tip with your arms extended, is virtually identical to your height. And mine,
a little bit longer, but close.
Out of curiosity, I measured mine. It's exactly the same.
So you're a little shorter than average then, because so am I. I'm exactly the same, which is actually slightly shorter than average.
But in the NBA, it's not like that. And this opens up a whole set of things that we'll talk some about, which is what we think of as specialization or selection, how certain traits are going to be in the marketplace rewarded disproportionately. So an NBA player's wingspan is, on average, how much more than his height?
The average ratio is about 1.05, so which means that the average NBA player is about 6'6 3/4, and his arm span is about 7 feet. And the short players, if they seem undersized for their position, are often even much longer than that to make up for it. So like a guy like Elton Brand, who I grew up in Chicago, and I remember when the Bulls drafted him at power forward because he's about 6'8", people were saying, oh, you're spending the first pick on a guy who's, maybe a little undersized at a power forward, but his arm span is 7'5". So he's a giant among power forwards if you look at it functionally.
Yeah, and Kevin Durant is also a big outlier on that.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the good guys are. So is LeBron James. And I wouldn't have even. What I was surprised when I was doing that was the guys that I would eyeball, and I would have thought like Tayshaun Prince was by far the longest in the NBA. And my eyeball assessment wasn't always right when I turned to the NBA Combine data. I wouldn't have guessed that LeBron James had particularly long arms, but he does.
Is that are those measurements pretty reliable, you think, at the Combine?
From the NBA Combine, they are. So from the media guides and like anywhere that you would Google a player's height, absolutely not.
Correct.
So while I was doing this data, I was figuring out sort of how NBA listings actually work. So most guys who are 7 feet, listed at 7 feet in the NBA, when they show it on TV, are actually about 6'10" and a half. Because what happens is at the Combine, they make them do real measurements where they have to take their shoes off and get measured. But then for some reason, they also measure them with their shoes on, as if they could just get them taller shoes and change that measurement. But what guys do in their reported height usually is they take their shoes on height from the measurement. So say they're 6'10" and a half. And with their shoes on, they're 6'11" and a quarter. And then they round it up to the next inch. So 6'10" and a half goes to 7 feet in most cases.
Okay, from now on, I'm saying I'm 5'9". Okay.
Yeah, except for Shaquille O'Neal, who's a true 7'1" with his shoes off.
And whose shoe is about like a 30? It's
yeah. He probably compresses it a lot though too, so he might not get as much height advantage out of it.
Now, talk about Marfan syndrome, which I didn't fully understand. You mentioned in the book a couple times. Isn't one of the symptoms of Marfan syndrome that phenomenon, the longer wingspan than height, or is that not right?
Yes, no, that's absolutely right. So Marfan syndrome is a disease of the connective tissues that can be potentially fatal because that includes like your coronary artery, which can rupture because of a problem with the connective tissues. And one of the most conspicuous signs of Marfan syndrome is elongated limbs, very long hands and very long arms, and often being very tall. And so actually a woman who was maybe one of the greatest volleyball players in American history named Flo Hyman, who was 6'7", actually died on the court, and it turned out she had Marfan syndrome. But one of the diagnostic criteria is the length of arms to the height.
So why do some NBA players have it?
I'm sure some NBA players do, and others get evaluated for it. So like I remember, and other people with long arms as well. So Michael Phelps, who has pretty long arms compared to his height, he wrote in one of his autobiographies that he was getting checked for it every year when he was a kid because some doctor looked at his arm span and said, we should keep a tabs on you. So it's often the case that people who have long arms, they don't necessarily have it, but they will have been checked for it by an astute doctor.
While we're on Michael Phelps, tell us why his body, what's unusual about his inseam and why that helps him, because that fascinated me.
So Michael Phelps is 6'4", and he has the same size pants as the guy who's 5'9" and holds the world record in the mile. And that guy has extraordinarily proportionally long limbs, and Michael Phelps has extraordinarily proportionally short limbs. Michael Phelps has this interesting mix of short legs, long torso. You want a long torso in swimming. That's the best. It's like the long hull of a canoe. And long arms. He has long arms and short legs, which is unusual. That said, there are other guys at his level who have that. He is not like alone on this body type island in elite swimming. There are others who have it.
I assume not, right? You assume not. So let's talk some more about body shape. If I think I understood it correctly, you made the argument in the book that if you simply had the height and weight of an Olympic roster, you could do a pretty good job of guessing what their events are. Is that correct?
That's definitely correct. I don't think you would get every person accurately, but having competed at the national level in track and field, I think you would get the vast majority of them correctly. And frankly, this I think you could do. You could definitely do it easily if you had them charted on a height and weight graph. And I think you could do it for most positions in something like football as well.
Yeah, one thing I learned that was very that made me feel better because I couldn't understand it was why the NFL running backs of recent years are so short. And I found that strange. I'd say you have a lot of people like Ray Rice who's listed. Again, some of these are not listed, I'm sure, at their actual height. But they're listed at 5'8", 5'9", 5'10". And you think, well, wouldn't it be better to have a running back who's 6'2" or 6'3"? There used to be some. Larry Johnson was a large running back. Yeah. Well, they could bowl people over. They'd be hard to tackle. And then you think, well, maybe they're low to the ground. They're harder to tackle, people claim. They, quote, have a lower center of gravity as if that's somehow a magical advantage. But that's not their advantage. It's something else.
Yeah, and there still are some big running backs, but they're increasingly rare. And actually, even as humanity has gotten taller, running backs have gotten shorter. And so in the shortest running distances, it's actually an advantage to be short. So shorter limbs have less what's called moment of inertia. It's like less resistance to beginning to be in motion. And so in any running task that is mostly comprised of acceleration as opposed to top speed, being small and actually having short legs is really advantageous. You look at a guy like Manti Te'o, who was the best defensive player in college football last year. When he went to the NFL Combine, he ran a terrible 40-yard dash, and everyone said, well, maybe he's not as good as we thought. But he has short legs, but he ran a great 10-yard dash, and that's really what he's going to do on the field. Yeah. And so running backs aren't very rarely running full speed. They're starting and stopping, and most of what they do is acceleration and deceleration. And in that, it's actually an advantage to be small.
So I'm readjusting my professional aspirations now from basketball to football. Because at 5'6", I have a huge advantage over Ray Rice. Of course, all these points have to do with the fact that there's other factors, but just that once you're selecting for, say, quick starts, say sprinting, or once you're selecting for long distances in the Olympics, say marathoning, it's going to be very difficult for a person without the ideal body type to compete because it's just a huge disadvantage.
Right. I mean, and there are people who find compensatory mechanisms, but all things being equal, those advantages are a big deal. And I don't know what Ray Rice's listed height is, but having stood next to him, I'd be shocked if he's actually over 5'8", and I wouldn't be shocked if he's under.
Yeah. Why are marathon runners small?
So in the marathon, it's sort of twofold. One reason is because one major limiting factor in endurance is your ability to dissipate heat quickly. So at about 104 degrees core temperature, you will slow down or stop. Your central nervous system will make you, unless you're taking amphetamines, which can sometimes override that and causes people to, cycle or run until they have heat stroke. But you have to unload heat, and the greater the surface area of your body is compared to your volume, the quicker you unload heat. It's just like a radiator, right, that has coils. The point of the coils is to increase the surface area to the volume to let the heat get out. And that becomes a really big advantage because we know the limiting factor of heat dissipation. And that said, smaller people also, because as you grow in height, your volume increases in 3 dimensions while your surface area only in 2. So you actually become sort of heavier for your size, and which can be a disadvantage for running economy as well.
And who's the woman, the tall women marathon runner who's great in cold weather and not in hot?
Paula Radcliffe. She's about 5'8", which for a female marathoner at her level is like a gigantic, So she's like literally, there are women like below her shoulder when she's running next to them. 5'2", 5'1". There's still be some 4'11" people who win major races in Olympics. There was a 4'11" Olympic champion recently, but hovering right around 5 feet often. And that's not to say there can't be taller ones, but it's quite rare, and they absolutely don't win when it's hot. Like if you want to place your bets when it's hot, you can just basically scratch off someone like Paula Radcliffe.
And she's undefeated in the winter. And
yeah, in the prime of her career, she was so dominant. She went, I think, 7-0 in fall marathons, and in the summer Olympics and warm weather marathons, she was never even a factor in the race.
So in the history, let's talk about speed and running. In the history, I'm quoting him from the book, in the history of American running, 17 men in the history of American running have run a time faster than 2 hours and 10 minutes for the 26.2-mile marathon.
Yeah.
I'm not one of them. I did break the 4.5 hour mark in 1976 in the one marathon. And I'm short too, which you'd think I could have done better than that, but it wasn't enough. So I didn't break 2:10, but 17 men in history have, and yet in American history, in October of 2011, 32 men from one part of Kenya broke 2:10.
From one tribe, that's right, and that's about 4:58 mile pace, I think. 32 Kalenjin men from the Kalenjin tribe, which is, so in the United States, we think of Kenyans as being great marathoners, but when I went to Kenya for the book, they think of the Kalenjin as being great marathoners. It's not to say that there aren't great marathoners from other places, but that's a minority tribe in Kenya, about 10 to 12% of the population, and I think over 80% of the elite runners.
I think I would need more than 10,000 hours to run a half a mile in 2.5 minutes, the pace at which they're running 26 consecutive miles. So this has intrigued a lot of people. And the other intriguing thought is that a very small country, Jamaica, has some of the fastest people in the world at short distances. Usain Bolt. And what do we think is going on there? It's not so straightforward, is it?
No, it's pretty complicated. And so let me start with the nature part. So every man who's been in an Olympic 100-meter final since the boycotted games of 1980, whether his homeland is the United States, Canada, Jamaica, Netherlands, Portugal, every single one has his ancestry from a small swath of West Africa. And that area happens to have people that tend to have just on average, a slightly higher proportion of fast-twitch muscle fibers, the kind that contract really explosively for activities like sprinting. So they have low-latitude ancestry. So they've evolved the adaptation of long limbs proportional to body type, good for running, bad for swimming, to unload heat. And they have a shift toward, just on average, higher proportion of fast-twitch muscle fibers. So you have a population that, all other things, being taken into account, in general, you'll find more people who are fit for explosive sports. But that said, it can't be all genes, because there are more people of Jamaican descent in the United States than there are in Jamaica. So it can't come down only to genes. So I read about some of those other factors as well.
Because the Americans the American team should be world class using just Jamaicans in America.
Yeah, and we are world class, but we're still getting our tails kicked by Jamaica. And I think that Jamaica is really making the most with its culture around sprinting of the talent pool that it does have. I mean, it's like high school track and field there is like Texas high school football here, with shady boosterism and all. When I went to the National High School Championships, which is over 30,000 people, like packed into a stadium, it's like a World Cup atmosphere for high school kids. I was asking coaches about recruiting, and they would tell me, well, we're not allowed to give refrigerators to parents anymore in an effort to get their kids to come to our school. I didn't even ask them that, but apparently there's all sorts of shady recruiting going on, and that event, it's the National High School Championships. They don't really even care about pro sprinting in Jamaica. There was no attendance at pro meets until the Asafa Powell Usain Bolt showdown before the 2008 Olympics. They would draw bigger crowds for the 5 and 6-year-old kids national championships. So there really is a lot of emphasis and a lot of fun events around youth sprinting in Jamaica, and the chances of a fast kid slipping through the cracks in Jamaica is like the chances of a good football player slipping through the cracks in the United States.
Yeah, I'm actually a big fan of shady recruiting practices. I think athletes should get at least refrigerators, or their parents. So I think that's probably good. But I don't know who's getting the rents that are now that used to go to the refrigerator.
I'm sure they're
donations.
figuring out something.
Yeah, I bet they are. What do we think? So that's sprinting. The Kenyan case and the marathon and the longer distances. Mm-hmm. It was quite fascinating. There's a lot of different hypotheses and theories. What are some of them, and what do you think we know and don't know?
So what's quite well evaluated is that the body type, not necessarily of Kenyans, but of the Kalenjin tribe in particular, is very well suited to long distance events. So this is as low latitude ancestry of population as you can get. I was crisscrossing the equator when I was visiting them, and in a hot and dry climate, they have extremely narrow pelvic breadth. So when you evolve in a low latitude environment with a hot and dry climate, you tend to follow something called Bergmann's law, which means you have whatever organism you are, human or other animal, where you have more narrow pelvic breadth, and Allen's law, which is that the closer to the equator you are, the longer your limbs are compared to your body size.
So just to generalize, Aleuts, people used to be called Eskimos. I guess that you mentioned it's not necessarily the politically correct term, but people who live in igloos tend to be short and stocky, and people who live near the equator tend to be tall and narrow.
That's right. So there's some variation depending on the microclimate. So if the people at the equator are in the rainforest, that can alter it somewhat, like it was the case for the Kikuyu, which is a larger tribe in Kenya. So theoretically, the ideal body type for heat conservation, at the North Pole would be a sphere, right? And so people tend toward that shape, which is they have a large volume compared to surface area, so they retain heat and they have short legs. And so they are becoming more spherical as you go north.
That's awesome. Well, it's like the Earth. The Earth's not really a sphere. It's taken millions of years of rotation to round off its rough edges, but that's not exactly what's happening. But it's the same process, I guess.
Right. And a pole would be the best at the equator, right? Yeah. Because that would unload heat through every surface and have a very small volume. And the reason that's important for running is it's really important to have what's called low distal weight in running, which means very little weight away from your center of mass. So your leg is a pendulum, basically, and the longer and lighter it is, the easier it is to swing. So in a laboratory setting, when 8-pound weight is strapped around a runner's waist, it increases energy consumption to run at a given pace about 4%. But if you take the same weight and put it in the form of 2 4-pound weights on the ankles, it increases energy consumption 24%. So where the weight is critical. And the build of the Kalenjin, which is called the nilotic body type, is what anthropologists call it, is on average really good for efficient running. And what studies have shown is that it's not that Kenyans, compared to like Danish runners, which are some of the studies I evaluate, they don't have a greater ability to use oxygen overall, but they get a much better pace for a given amount of oxygen because their running economy is so good.
And the oxygen issue arises because I assume, I don't remember, but I assume the Kalenjin are at altitude.
The Kalenjin are at altitude, but more important, so there's been this rhetorical question.
Because that's the issue of whether training, being born at altitude, being born a mile high or 2 mile or a mile and a half high is an advantage or not. Because it certainly is an advantage if you show up on their track out of the blue, you're going to struggle.
For sure. No question. You'll actually be sort of, if you just show up, you'll be hyperventilating while you get used to, without knowing it, while you get used to those conditions. But the altitude, so there's been this rhetorical question in track and field for years about, well, if it's just the altitude, then why aren't Tibetans dominating? And there are a number of reasons why that's kind of a fallacy. One is because their climate's quite different and they are not as linear. 2, they are too high for the kind of intense training. There's sort of an altitude sweet spot where you get the increase in red blood cells and the adaptation to the lower oxygen, but you can still run hard. But really, an important factor is what you want is to be not genetically adapted to altitude. So you want to have sea level ancestry so that when you come up to altitude, you increase red blood cells. So Tibetans have a gene that stops them from overproducing red blood cells at altitude so that their blood doesn't get too thick. So they don't get one of the changes that runners want when they go to altitude. So you want sea level ancestry, but to grow up at altitude, because then you'll have the increased red blood cells. And if you're there before puberty, you'll have a higher surface area of your lungs, which is better for your diffusing oxygen into the blood. And that is exactly the case of the minority tribes in Kenya and Ethiopia that dominate running, is they have sea level ancestry, but in recent history moved to altitude, to mid-level altitude.
And how much training are they doing?
A lot, and it's not systematic training though. So there, I thought maybe there would be like some coaching secrets in Kenya, but like a lot of gold medalists don't even have coaches. But what they do have is, first of all, many of them have grown up running to and from school. So they sort of know who the faster kids are, and they're primed for training, partly because they are used to running and they're not overweight. So I think there are plenty of people with talent for running who won't find out because you're not prepared to even start trying to train if you're overweight, basically. But so these kids will grow up running to and from school, and then there's no opportunity cost for them to try training. So I remember in 2008,
because they have such a poor country.
That's right. That's why all the runners are coming from these impoverished rural areas. And in 2008, the U.S., there was a guy named Brian Sell who was on the U.S. Olympic marathon team, and he was putting off dental school to chase his Olympic dream. Like, there's no putting off dental school in rural Kenya.
Unfortunately.
Right? So guys will, unfortunately, right. So if guys will wander literally off of subsistence farms in sandals and try to run an interval next to a Jeffrey Mutai, who won the Boston Marathon. They'll literally do that because there's no opportunity cost, and most of them will fall by the wayside because they can't do that, and a couple will be able to stick with it, and that's where the world beaters come from.
How far have we gotten in identifying the genetic basis for some of these traits that you've mentioned that are beneficial for athletes?
It's a big mix. We've gotten not far in identifying the genes that are associated with learning motor skills. That said, there is some early work now on a gene, for example, called BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And I actually cut this one from the book because I had to cut a lot of space. But there are different versions that involve metabolism of brain chemicals, and that people with a certain version seem to they seem to learn skills quicker, basically learn motor skills quicker and forget and less often sort of forget if they are made to sort of simulate driving along some sort of course, that they retain the memory of where they're supposed to be going better, and they pick up the skills quicker. That said, most of the genes involved in motor skills, we know the genes are involved from studies of twin studies and things like that, but we don't know what they are. In other skills, like endurance training, exercise genetics is really rewriting our whole notion of talent from something that pre-exists the opportunity to train, which was literally the definition in a lot of sports psychology papers until recently, to genes, to your biological setup that allows you to profit from training more rapidly than the next guy. I mean, for the book, I got tested for some of those genes that predispose one to being what's called a high responder to training. And sure enough, I had a lot of genes that predisposed me to having a rapid response to endurance training, which is exactly what I saw in my athletic career, where I didn't start out that well, but I progressed at a much faster rate than some of the guys I was training with.
Yeah, you give the example in the book of Jim Ryan, who I remember from my youth, who was the world record mile holder, as somebody who just exploded from being an okay runner to a world-class runner by some practice.
Yeah, I mean, he went from running a 5:38 mile to a 4:08 basically in a season. Which is...
That's mind-boggling.
Obviously, that's extreme. But there are also two genes in the book that I highlight that are unusual in the fact that the more of the study there is, the less it looks like single genes have huge effects in most cases. So there's some diseases where we know that's the case, but they are the minority. But there are two genes I highlight in the book where a single version of a gene has made a huge difference to an individual's athletic performance. Those are few and far between, but those cases, they do exist.
I want to come back to those, but I first want to emphasize, because one of the themes of this program is the role of complexity and the difficulty we have in untangling causation. A theme that comes up now and then in the book is that the relationship between particular genes and outcomes are much more complicated than we originally thought.
Yeah, much. I mean, basically, when the human genome was sequenced a decade ago, there was some wishful thinking from scientists, and it was interesting to go look up old articles where you'll see people saying, well, now we've got the whole instruction manual for the human body. In 5 years, you're going to be carrying around your genome in a card in your wallet and present it to your doctor. And so 10 years later, not even close. And so it turns out that genetics has been more complicated at sort of every possible turn. The main initial complication being that genes work in networks and rely upon one another. So they have to be studied in networks most of the time. So if you change one gene, it might change how the others are functioning. And they have differential response to different environments. And many of them have effects that are so small on their own that the studies that were conducted looking at them were too small to detect that effect. So we're now coming around to more novel ways of studying it and making more progress, but it's been much more complicated than originally thought.
So there's a nice statistic in the book. You say, in 1975, this is a quote, in 1975, athletes in the major American sports averaged roughly 5 times the median salary for an American man. Today, the average salaries in those sports are between 40 and 100 times the median full-time salary, close quote. And that's a revolution that's due to technology, the ability to sell your services around the world effectively. You have more bidders, but you also reach more people through television, the web, the net. Everything has just changed in sports, and it reinforces a point I like to make, that there are different sources for inequality, and some of those sources are not political, or they're not a conspiracy. It's what Sherwin Rosen and Ed Lazier in a landmark paper called The Economics of Superstars, and it's been taken and written about by a lot of people, that the very high end of the skill distribution in lots of areas get a lot more money than they used to. What's that doing to – one of the things it's done is, of course, as we already talked about, it's changed what sports people go out for. It's a lot more expensive to miss your ideal sport, so people switch sports to the ones that are the most rewarding economically and financially. They still do some things they might love, but the cost has gotten higher of doing that. And it's also led to some genetic testing and some market opportunities for people that may not be so successful or maybe so attractive. Talk about what the role of money in sports is doing with that genetic overlap.
Well, so I think there are two sort of different issues there. One is that explosion of potential compensation for sports has led to really a worldwide talent search, and to many more people in different parts of the world wanting to participate in those sports if they can. Like you mentioned, for 7-footers, give it a shot, because it's a potentially hugely lucrative lifestyle. And that's led to this extreme specialization of body types in sports, where in some of the sports psychology literature, because athletes have gotten better and better, the papers will argue, well, that they've gotten better so much faster than genes could have evolved, so it must be practice. But that's not the case. The gene pool in the sports has changed for sure. I mean, the proportion of NBA players that were 7 feet doubled, like almost overnight, when the league became, very lucrative.
That's because people were practicing getting taller.
Yeah, right. But it's gone down even to the micro level, to things you wouldn't expect. Like water polo players now have longer proportional forearms to their total limb, because it helps for throwing, than they did in the past. So it's even going to the micro level, and that's why I likened it to these athletic bodies fitting into their sporting niches, like Darwin's finches' beaks did into their niches. And the scientists who sort of tracked this trend call it the Big Bang of body types, because the body type for any given sport is sort of getting weirder and blasting apart from all the others. So female gymnasts in the last 30 years have shrunk on average from 5'3" to 4'9". But yeah, so that's the gene pool really is changing in sports. But you also mentioned the kind of, I think you were getting at sort of the direct-to-consumer genetic testing.
Yeah. That interested me too.
So that is exploding faster than anybody is discussing it. There are now plenty of companies that will test your genes for you, and I've participated in a couple of those. But in most cases, the marketing is way ahead of the actual science. So the most popular gene test that's offered to parents is the ACTN3 gene, the so-called SPRINT gene, because it codes for a protein found in fast-twitch muscle fibers. And if you have the so-called wrong version, you're just not going to be in the Olympic 100-meter final. I'm sorry, that's just a fact. But if you do, that only rules out about 1 billion of 7 billion people on Earth. So this test is being marketed to parents saying, take this and find out if your kid is going to be a sprinter. You're like, well, fine. So he's lumped in with the other 6 billion instead of the 1 billion. It accounts for a small amount of variance at the top level. So the marketing is well beyond what it should be. That said, there are some tests for things like a gene that we know predisposes kids to, or anybody, to permanent brain damage if they take hits to the head like in football. That one I'm frustrated there's not more marketing behind it because people aren't really aware of it. And that one I think people actually should take advantage of.
You close your book with the story of one of the greatest cross-country skiers and Olympians of all time. Talk briefly about what role genetics played in his story.
Yes, this is a man named Eero Manturanta, and he was in the 1960s possibly the greatest endurance athlete in the world. Certainly up there. He won 7 Olympic medals, 3 of them gold. He sort of came from this tiny Arctic hamlet and didn't have much. Didn't even really know what it was to be a professional athlete, but he had grown up skiing across a frozen lake to and from school, very much like a Kenyan kid does for running, and just wanted a better life. And realized he had pretty good talent for cross-country skiing. But when he would be examined medically, he had this huge proportion of red blood cells, much, much bigger than is normal. And so he looked like even an extreme version of athletes who are doping by using the hormone EPO, which is what, Tour de France cyclists made famous, basically. It's a synthetic version of the hormone in the body that cues your body to produce red blood cells. And so it was assumed that Eero was somehow finding a way to blood dope, and that was the cause of his success. But 20 years after he retired, a group of scientists who got curious, who were finding these high blood levels in other members of his family, came and examined the whole family and found that some of them had this rare version of the EPO receptor gene. That the receptor is like the lock and the hormone is like a key, and when they're put together, stuff starts happening. And they had a rare version of this EPO receptor gene that caused the body to be extremely overly sensitive to EPO and to go crazy producing red blood cells. And that's what gave Arrow this incredible oxygen delivery capacity. So other members of his family who have the gene, like his nephew, also won a gold medal. And the members of the family who don't have it are not good ski racers. And so I thought that was a really interesting example and a rare case where a single gene makes a huge difference.
Well, it's a beautiful story, and you write it very, very eloquently about your visit to his place in the middle of nowhere.
He's a reindeer farmer in the Arctic, yeah.
But what fascinated me about his story is that resents might be too strong a word, but he doesn't believe, he doesn't like believing, I think, and I understand this, that he had a genetic advantage.
Yeah, that's right. And that actually it was surprisingly rare when I talked to athletes. For the most part, I found elite athletes to be the most accepting of the idea that they had certain gifts. And maybe that's because at that level, with almost no exceptions, they train as hard as they can and they still get beat sometimes. Yeah. So maybe they understand
and
that.
Everybody they know is pretty gifted.
Right. But for Arrow, he was sort of, and I think part of that was because his whole career was conducted under this cloud of doping suspicion, right? Where people assumed that he was doping in some way they just couldn't figure out.
But of course, he was kind of doping. Right?
He was naturally doped.
He's naturally doping, which is unattractive. Right? It's basically saying even though he wasn't a cheater, his critics were right in some dimension.
And there are other athletes out there who have these high red blood cell levels. We don't know if they have the gene mutation or not, but they basically get a doctor's note for their competitions that say, these have been documented as natural in me. I'm not cheating. But he was resistant to that idea. He said he would kind of sort of say, well, but it also thickened my blood, and so I think it balances out and everything. And of course, the doctors who examined him said, no, his oxygen carrying capacity was unbelievable. It's a huge advantage.
So you could argue, if you were one of his competitors, that you should be allowed to dope to make it a level playing field.
I guess you could, except for
it's against the rules, but
except for it's you. So the reason that Arrow's genetic gift was able to be found was because it came from a single gene. That doesn't mean that his competitors don't have gifts. They clearly do. They're just harder to detect. Arrow's gene mutation never would have been detected if a group of Finnish scientists 20 years later hadn't said, let's look into this. So if those athletes' idea is that they don't have, it's not fair, then that's a slippery slope for them, because then they'd somehow have to allow every guy on the street to mimic their genetic gifts.
But I think that's the central policy, ethical, philosophical issue around sports these days with this obsession with testing. And it's such a strange thing. Barry Bonds is a cheater. Because he is allegedly a cheater because he allegedly took a steroid to help him bulk up. But he has so many other gifts. Everybody accepts that. It's not like he's me. He had innumerable gifts of eyesight and a huge amount of work. And so to me, how are we going to speculate about how we're going to distinguish between so-called natural gifts and so-called unnatural gifts? And I put so-called after unnatural because it's not clear what's natural and what's unnatural. Is lifting weights unnatural? Why is it that cheating? And it gets at the heart of what competition is, right? Because we care about competition because there's a justice issue that we want to see the best person triumph, but there's also a beauty issue. We want to see the faster and faster people. We want the ball to go farther in a home run contest. So to me, these are blurry lines that I'm not sure we really ever can successfully keep straight.
Right. I think it's a very difficult issue. And I don't kind of talking about a level playing field isn't naturally, at least, isn't always a big concern for me, because what I think is the coolest about sports is the display of human biological diversity. So I don't want to see like a bunch of clones or identical twins who are only separated by practice. But that said, I think I've tried to I've thought about this a lot because I've done a lot of reporting on doping. And In the book I even write about a gene that gets some people through drug testing. But about what sports are, and I love the take of this philosopher Bernard Suits, who spends a whole book trying to define them in a sentence, and he comes up with the voluntary acceptance of unnecessary obstacles. And I kind of like that. And it makes me think, even the rules that we think are stupid in sports, there's hardly anything so dependent for its core values upon agreed upon rules. So like cork, I have no moral qualms with cork. Never mind, it doesn't work, but it's banned. So I think
corking a bat.
Corking a bat, right? So I think it's totally fair for people to kind of lobby for the rules changes and that we should talk about them in a non-hysterical manner, which it seems almost impossible to do when it comes to doping now. But that in the meantime, the core values of sport do depend at least on the agreed upon rules.
This is true. This is true. It's hard to know what those rules should be, I guess, is the challenge. And the role of testing is imperfect. The amount of effort and energy we spend on it is high.
Yeah.
That means there's people getting away with stuff, others aren't. People complain about Barry Bonds. The pitchers were using steroids. It's just bizarre.
Well, let me tell you. I mean, the public reputation of drug testing far, far exceeds its capabilities. The rate of false negatives in drug testing, enormous.
That's a false negative being
someone who's doping and they pass the drug test.
Yeah.
Enormous.
Yeah, it's good to know. It's something we should remember. One thing you didn't talk about is the Dominican Republic's dominance of baseball.
Mm-hmm.
Did you think about that at all when you wrote the book?
I did think about it, and I did some reporting on it as well. And the reason I didn't kind of bring it into play was when I wanted to talk about sort of these hot spots of athletic development. I decided ultimately, partly for space and partly for accessibility to different sports, was to pick the hotspots that were recognized more globally in sports that are globally competitive. So baseball, of course, the idea of a World Series is a pretty big joke because there's only a couple countries that even attempt to play and to find their best athletes.
Yeah, mainly ours, but there is that new thing. Yeah, I don't consider the World Baseball Classic.
Right. I am really interested in the fact that Japan and Taiwan always do so well in the Little League World Series. I think they just won their third out of four. Japan did, or two other, and then but are surprisingly underrepresented at the professional level, at least in the United States. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. But yeah, mostly I decided that if I was going to pick my hot spots, I was probably going to have space for two, and that I wanted to go with things globally competitive.
Do you have any thoughts on the Dominican Republic?
Yeah, I think their development system is like the baseball version of Jamaican track and field.
It's
where
incredible.
You have high incentives. You have little opportunity cost for a lot of the competitors, and you put a bunch of people on the professionals training plan, and you accept the ones who come through. I also think of the Dominican Republic. One thing that deterred me a little bit is Dominicans are highly overrepresented among people who test positive for drugs. And if you graph the chances of a player testing positive based on country of origin against GDP, it's like a very tight inverse relationship. So
you're talking about steroids. You're talking about performance-enhancing drugs.
Performance-enhancing drugs, that's right. And so it suggests to me, that the less opportunity there is, the more likely they are to dope. And my colleague John Wertheim, in a book called Scorecasting, it's kind of a freakonomics of sport. He breaks down drug tests and shows that for players in the minor leagues, first of all, Dominican players are much more likely than others to test positive. But that even a player who tests positive has a 70% better chance, even if they are suspended and test positive, of moving to the next level of baseball, whereas an extra year of experience only increases their chances 20%. So even getting caught is well worth it.
Wow. Well, let's close talking about the diversity you mentioned a minute ago, because I like the way you celebrate that at the end of the book. Talk about why you think sports is so beautiful that way.
Well, first of all, in the section of the book where I depart from sports for the longest, I guess, span of words, I talk about sort of what race does and doesn't mean in a genetic perspective anyway, and this idea that we really, all of us outside of Africa have only been out here for a relatively short span of time in evolutionary terms. And so all this genetic variation that was built up in Africa is mostly still there and only very little outside. So if you got rid of all of us outside of Africa, you wouldn't lose that much. But it also means, the vast majority of our genes are quite similar, but what's different is enough to cause huge differences, even between brothers and sisters who draw their genetic material from the same place. But mixing of genes causes them never to be identical. And I just think it is what sports are and should be is an attempt to get the most out of what someone's gifts are and see how they can be used uniquely. And there are all these, not only different sports, but different positions within different sports. Like look at a football field. You almost have the extremes of the human physique represented on the field at one time. And I just find that to be really cool and fascinating and a big departure from the early 20th century idea that the average body type was the best for all endeavors and that anything that deviated from that was basically a mistake.
My guest today has been David Epstein. He's author of The Sports Gene. David, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thanks for having me.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.